Hello, I'm Robert Bastian of Laryngopedia and Bastian Voice Institute. This video is the introduction to a new series focused on what I call my Integrative Diagnostic Model for Voice Disorders. This series is for anyone with a high level of interest in voice, whether you're a laryngologist, a speech pathologist, singing teacher, voice coach, or a motivated layperson. This introductory video sets the stage for everything that follows about my diagnostic model, both in this installment and the ones to come. If you're just joining this journey, this is where to begin. Before we dive into the nuts and bolts, the details of the Integrative Diagnostic Model and its application, let's talk briefly about what I mean by a diagnostic model. Simply put, it's the tools and the sequence of using those tools that takes us from a patient's chief complaint to a clear diagnostic understanding of the voice. Now, we use models in many areas of life, so let's take baseball as an analogy. There are tools and there is a sequence of their use to play baseball. The necessary tools are the field, the bases, the bat, the ball, gloves, and umpire and players. Now, optional tools might include a stadium, spectators, TV cameras, and statisticians, but you don't need those lesser tools to play a proper game. There's also a necessary sequence to playing baseball: the wind-up, the pitch, the swing, run to first, then second, then third, and then home. You don't swing the bat before the pitch or run the bases in reverse order. So again, there are tools and a sequence for baseball, and voice diagnosis is no different. There are essential tools and a proper sequence for using them, and we have available some things that are used often but are not essential. Now, a sampling of possible diagnostic tools would include, of course, the patient's history, maybe via questionnaire, the vocal capability battery, videostroboscopy, electroglottography, electromyography, and acoustic and aerodynamic measures. And of course, you need the evaluators, the laryngologist, the speech pathologist, the neurologist, the singing teacher. So those are the tools that we bring to a voice disorder. Now, over my years as a laryngologist, I've noticed that different clinics use different models. They configure the use of these optional tools differently. They have different people doing different things. So I'm not here to disrespect or to put aside anyone else's model, to each his own, but to promote my own. And to do that, I've tried to abstract and even exaggerate, for the purpose of clarity of understanding, three general diagnostic models that I've encountered. So the first of these would be the traditional model. That would include basic unsophisticated history, a basic laryngeal examination. It takes one clinician and it's done very quickly, takes about 10 minutes. The disadvantage is that many diagnoses are missed. This traditional model is what I was trained on as a resident. And then I became aware at voice meetings that you could do much more. At that time, there was a boom, there was a burgeoning in technology that was applied to voice, looking at vocal output, whether acoustic, aerodynamic, and so forth. So I call that the technology-driven team model. And so in that model, there's a history still, and it's really histories because usually there's a laryngologist and a speech pathologist, and sometimes even a singing teacher. There's auditory perceptual assessment, which was very basic in my experience, just saying the voice sounded rough or whatever. And then there were these so-called objective, you notice I put it in quotation marks, measures of phonatory function. And that's what I call the microphenomenology. And think of that as being 2 or 3 clinicians and 2 to 6 hours by the time you gather everything, collate it. There are the communications back and forth, the letters between the different individuals. The pendulum swung dramatically to that opposite extreme from the traditional model, and we got too much. The technology or team-driven model, extensive testing, multiple specialists, lots of instruments, the rise of EMG, jitter, shimmer, signal-to-noise ratios, airflow of voicing, The advantage, we did add some additional diagnostic sensitivity. The disadvantage, again, very costly, very time-consuming. And a major disadvantage is that in spite of all this effort, diagnoses were still missed. So like the Goldilocks story, the traditional model is too cold, the technology-driven and team model is too hot. Well, what is just right? In my opinion, it's the integrative diagnostic model. So some of you may already be familiar with this from my many other writings, but it includes 3 parts. I developed it many years ago to arrive powerfully and efficiently at a precise and descriptive diagnosis of nearly any voice disorder. So these 3 diagnostic elements I consider to be both necessary and sufficient to arrive at a clear diagnosis every time. So the sophisticated history is what the person tells you. The vocal capability battery, VCB, is what the voice tells you by interacting directly with it. And then third is what the larynx tells you with a very high quality laryngeal examination. So I sometimes call this bare hands laryngology. That's my way of highlighting our reliance on ourselves, our ears, our voices, our eyes, as the most important diagnostic tools. So we answer critical yes/no questions in the history, yes/no questions in the vocal phenomenology, and yes/no questions in the laryngeal examination. There are no complicated instruments other than videostroboscopy, which is just an extension of our vision. There's no expensive software program or other piece of equipment. Now, I think most who are watching this will intuitively understand the idea of a sophisticated history and a good laryngeal examination, but they may not be quite as sure about the vocal capability battery. And so let me take a brief sidebar here, especially about part 2 of the model, the vocal capability battery. That part of the evaluation is the examiner eliciting voice from the patient, asking them to do various things with their voice, and then judging what happens when they try those tasks. We're not focusing on microphenomenology, things like signal-to-noise ratio, jitter, shimmer, airflow measures. Instead, we're focusing on macro vocal phenomenology, what the voice can and cannot do. And we end up with a deep understanding of what I call the capabilities, the limitations, and the aberrations of the voice. Now, these observations are highly revealing. Rather than collecting a flood of quantitative data, we're asking simple yes/no questions. It may sound to some a bit Yoda-like, but it's actually very teachable to anyone with a modest connection to their own voice. The clinician must have at least a minimal level of what I call vocal self-rapport, and I've made videos on that subject of vocal rapport. And once the vocal capability battery is mastered, and we do that with our fellows here, and as long as they can match pitch, we can bring them a great distance in our fellowship year, and it's modest effort that they need to expend, and then they can apply the vocal capability battery to any individual patient in just 1 or 2 minutes of the clinical encounter. Now, this approach doesn't just save time and money. More importantly, it delivers superior diagnostic insight. I've argued elsewhere in lectures, articles, tutorials that non-instrumented macro voice evaluation, macro phenomenology is powerful. Instrumented measures, often time inefficient, they're costly, and actually they're weak diagnostically. Unless a lot of viewers requested, I won't rehash that debate over the so-called objective measures here. They do have their role for biofeedback and for publication, but in the clinical realm of limited utility. Now back to the model. The model has 3 parts, and again, the history, what the patient tells us, the vocal capability battery, what the voice tells us, and then the examination, what the vocal cords tell us. So most people grasp parts 1 and 3 easily. We listen to the patient's story and we look at the larynx. So let's return briefly to part 2, the vocal capability battery, and explain why it's so important. And in getting there, I'm going to offer a navigation analogy to distinguish macro from micro phenomenology. So imagine you wake up alone, you're adrift on a floating laboratory boat. It's well equipped with lots of provisions and equipment and so forth, and you're able to run the boat all by yourself. You're on calm seas, you have all the supplies, but you don't know where you are. Your goal is to get home to Miami, but you scan the horizon and there's water in every direction. So what kind of navigational model will help you find your way to Miami? Well, the microphenomenologist might scoop up a bucket of seawater and go into the laboratory on this laboratory boat and start analyzing plankton populations. Or they might measure trace minerals like iron or magnesium, because those minerals vary in different places around the globe. And so the person is going to publish norms and figuring out where the plankton counts are similar to what you're getting on your boat. But the problem is those plankton and mineral profiles can be similar in very different parts of the world. Now, this isn't to say that there might not be a use for magnesium measurement for a documentary about the trip or a scientific publication. It's just to say that those kinds of micro-phenomenological things are not going to get us to Miami very efficiently. Well, what about the macro-phenomenologist? That's what I'm saying is important. He or she uses the North Star, the sun, the passage of the sun across the sky, the global positioning GPS satellites, or ship-to-shore radio contact. These are broad sort of macro signals. They take you, in a sense, up above your boat 30,000 feet so that you can look around and see where you are. The point is that the micro level data, the microphenomenology, magnesium and plankton, may be interesting, but they're very inefficient and insufficient. Macro level observations are necessary and sufficient both for effective navigation. And so now I'm going to say the same for diagnosing voice disorders. It's the macro phenomenology of the voice, not the micro, that is useful. So to wrap up, when I evaluate a voice disorder, the necessary and sufficient tools to play the game of baseball, to navigate from a ship in the middle of an ocean, or to navigate a voice disorder. So for the voice disorder, used in sequence, they are the history, that's what the patient tells us, the vocal capability battery, what the voice reveals through assessment of its macro phenomenology, and the intense laryngeal examination. So in the videos to come, we will explore each of these parts in detail, along with practical tips and examples for using the model. Next up is the history, and that's the next episode I'm working on and hope to bring to you soon, so stay tuned. And thank you for listening.